Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we have a fascinating and historically loaded stack of sources in front of us.
We really do. We've got theological commentary, ancient customs, and a very specific, very modern case study.
And we're going to use all of it to wrestle with one essential concept. How do we balance hierarchy and order with, fundamental human equality?
Exactly. We are diving deep into source material on church structure, on organizational principles, and it's primarily centered on an interpretation of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, specifically verses 1 through 16.
Okay.
And the sources, they identify this core theme as order in the church, focusing on a concept the material calls dengchi.
Dengchi. And what does that translate to, roughly?
You could translate it as sequence, grade, or maybe rank. Our mission today is to understand dengshi and figure out if it's even possible for a structure like that to exist without creating fundamental inequality.
And that's the ultimate challenge, isn't it? Because the foundational text, it lays out this very specific, almost intimidating relational order.
It's a theological chain of command, really.
A chain of command. It goes, God is the head of Christ, Christ is the head of man, and then man is the head of woman. For anyone listening, steeped in modern democratic ideals, that structure immediately raises a red flag.
It absolutely does. The tension is palpable. I mean, if one entity is the head of another, doesn't that inherently imply a lesser worth for the one being headed?
That's the question.
And the sources are really keen to dissect this. They argue that you have to separate the organizational role from the intrinsic value of the person.
Okay, so let's start with the historical reality Paul was dealing with. I mean, this text wasn't written in a vacuum. What was the social climate in Corinth actually like, especially for women?
Well, the historical context is just essential here. We're looking at ancient Eastern society where, generally speaking, discrimination against women was intense, it was structural.
Right.
The sources really highlight that outside of some specific and often pretty questionable roles in pagan temples, women just lacked status and power. That oppressive environment is the baseline Paul is reacting to.
And that environment informed the customs mentioned in the text, like head coverings. We read that women were expected to have long hair and cover their heads in public.
Yes, but we need to be very clear about what the source materials say about this specific covering.
Okay, what do they say?
The clarification is vital because I think a lot of modern readers, they automatically assume a full face covering.
Sure. Something like a veil.
Exactly. But the source material is adamant. Paul did not use the word for a full face covering. Instead, the custom involved using a general scarf or a shawl.
So the physical action of covering the head was really a profound social signal.
A huge signal. It symbolized a woman's recognition of and obedience to the established social and spiritual order, the dengshi.
And here is where the specific dynamic of the early Christian community really comes into play. If Christian women, particularly when they were praying or speaking publicly, chose to disregard this custom and appear uncovered, what was the implication of that?
Oh, it would have been seen as a daring, disruptive, and even blasphemous act. It was a deliberate rejection of the prevailing order.
Wow.
And you have to remember, the early church was trying to find stability and legitimacy in a really hostile environment. So when Paul steps in, his primary goal isn't to enforce ancient misogyny, it's to restore order. He needs to make sure the church's witness isn't undermined by what the outside world would have seen as just social anarchy.
So Paul steps in and he introduces this really crucial distinction that forms the backbone of the argument in our sources. He says, God created men and women as different. And I want to spend a moment here because in that ancient society, different almost always meant inferior.
Precisely. And Paul insists that this difference in creation led to distinct positions, distinct dengshi within God's management plan. But, and this is key, he carefully avoids equating that difference with inferiority.
So he sees a necessary structural sequence, not a judgment on inherent worth.
Exactly. The roles may differ, but the spiritual value, the fundamental equality does not.
But practically speaking, for anyone listening, how can rank or structure not feel like a value judgment? I mean, if I'm subordinate to someone, doesn't that inherently reflect a lower perceived competence or worth?
And this is where we have to adopt the specific mental framework that's provided in the sources. The best way to understand it is through their warship analogy.
Okay, warship.
Think of a warship in battle. You have the captain, you have the officers, and you have the sailors. The captain holds the highest dengshi, the highest rank. Why?
For efficiency, I assume, you need a clear chain of command.
For immediate effective action and safe navigation. Without rank, the ship sinks. It's that simple.
So the rank, the Ding Chi, it's purely operational. It's about function in a crisis.
Exactly. Now consider the sailor down in the engine room. His rank is low, but he might possess superior character, more integrity, more moral clarity, even more spiritual wisdom than the captain. The sources really emphasize that rank, which is an organizational necessity, and worth, which is personal value, are two entirely separate variables. The sailor's worth isn't defined by his lower rank, it's defined by his inherent value as a person. Order, Deng Shi, is necessary for corporate peace and management, but it never diminishes inherent worth.
That distinction rank is organizational necessity versus worth as inherent value. That feels like the intellectual lever that unlocks the rest of this material.
It is, and the value of this framework is that it holds true even as the world around it changes, which is what we see as we move into the next section.
Right, so let's pivot to the modern world, specifically the free democratic societies that are cited in the sources. We're talking about Taiwan, Japan, or the US. Ancient constraints on women are long gone.
Completely gone.
Women drive, they vote, they serve in government, they operate freely in the public sphere. We just don't rely on social custom to enforce Deng Chi anymore.
And this is important. Social progress is good, but it doesn't nullify the underlying theological concept of fundamental equality. The sources call this pingdeng.
Pingdeng, equality.
Right. Regardless of cultural shifts, the source maintains that both men and women are created in God's image. They share an absolute spiritual equality, a pingdeng.
So we're establishing this kind of two-pronged reality. We have equality in worth, pingdeng, and we have different roles, which sometimes require a sequence of authority, the Ding Chi.
Exactly.
The challenge then becomes applying this practically in a modern organization without letting the Ding Chi just devolve into a vehicle for human power struggles.
And for that, we look at this extraordinary practical example provided by the North Plain Church, or NPC, in Hualien, Taiwan.
This is a small church, right? Only about 50 people.
50 people.
Yeah.
And they've spent nearly 2 decades building a system specifically designed to uphold both pingdeng, equality, and ethical Ding Shi order.
What immediately stands out about NPC's structure is how they assign responsibilities. The sources say they base roles not on gender or seniority, but on God-given gifts. They call it ansi.
That concept of ansi, or gifts, is critical. It mandates that participation must be willing and voluntary, and that the organization's structure has to flow from demonstrated ability and character.
Not just who you are, but what you can do and what your character is like.
Precisely. And to ensure this, they instituted a rigorous 2-decade-long leadership training methodology.
Okay, tell us about that training pipeline. I mean, how do you develop leaders from a small congregation of only 50 people?
It's remarkably structured. When a congregation member shows spiritual maturity and potential, they're invited to participate in Sunday pulpit practice. It starts with something small, a manageable ask.
Like what?
A 5-minute thematic share.
Oh, that's low stakes.
Yeah.
It lets them practice in front of the community without too much pressure.
Exactly. If they're successful with that, they progress to a 15-minute formal sermon, and it's very focused. 1 Bible verse, 1 theme. This tests their focus, their preparation, their ability to present.
Okay.
But here's the most critical part of the order system. After the member's 15-minute share, the pastor, who's been there for 35 years,
Wow, 35 years.
he follows up with about 30 minutes of deep teaching on the exact same text and theme.
Ah, so why is that 30-minute follow-up so important?
It ensures theological consistency. It prevents the church from being guided by, potentially immature or incomplete spiritual interpretations. It's mentorship built right into the organizational structure.
I see. So only those who successfully navigate this whole system are then considered potential key co-workers and future church officials, like elders or deacons.
They have to prove their character and their diligence.
So now we get to the mechanisms NPC put in place to specifically combat the secular corruption that Paul warned the Corinthians about, this idea of factionalism, which the sources call Jidun Lapai.
Yes, cliquishness, forming factions.
And their rules for electing officials, they seem truly surgical in preventing political manipulation.
They are. Rule number 1 is a direct assault on family or clan monopolization. To prevent a powerful family from dominating the church structure, they instituted a rule. Only one spouse from a qualified couple may serve as an elder or a deacon at any given time.
Wait, hold on. That means if a husband is serving as an elder and his wife is perhaps even more qualified and better trained, she has to step aside.
She must step aside.
That seems almost unfair to the individual. How do the sources justify that kind of necessary sacrifice?
The justification is organizational integrity over individual ambition. The sources argue that the primary mission of Dengxi is to maintain peace. Allowing powerful families to occupy multiple high-ranking roles creates the potential for that Jidenglepai,
The factionalism.
the cliquishness and political maneuvering that destroyed the Corinthian church. NPC prioritizes the health of the entire organism over the ambition of a single, highly qualified couple. It's a structural countermeasure to human political nature.
That is a profound commitment to organizational democracy. What are the other safeguards they have?
Okay, so Rule 2 addresses ethnic bias. The church is explicitly committed to disregarding background in selection. Whether someone is Taiwanese, indigenous, Hakka, or mainland Chinese, it is completely irrelevant to the process.
So the focus is purely on character and demonstrated on C, the gifts.
Purely. And the third rule guards the selection process itself.
How do they keep it a spiritual decision rather than just a popularity contest?
The election relies entirely on the believers freely choosing who they genuinely believe the Holy Spirit is guiding them to select. And crucially, the pastor, despite his 3 decades of sermon, does not recommend, promote, or lobby for any candidate.
He separates himself from the politics completely.
Totally. It's to maintain the integrity of the spiritual selection process.
So the standard for leadership in NPC is incredibly demanding, but it appears to be entirely focused on preventing human corruption from hijacking the structural order. What's the overarching standard for these elected officials?
They must be role models in every single way. Their rank demands exemplary conduct.
What does that look like in practice?
That means perfect meeting attendance, a positive attitude in service, faithfulness in financial giving, and a good witness in their marriages and their families. The system creates a necessary order that is self-regulating. It's controlled by character, not by secular manipulation or favoritism.
This moves the concept of hierarchy far beyond just a simple chart of authority. It becomes a chart of proven integrity.
Exactly. And this framework is directly applicable to secular organizations. I mean, if Dengxi exists everywhere, in corporations, nonprofits, government, how do these principles of order without inferiority translate?
Right, let's connect this to the workplace. In a company, you have leaders, the upper ranks, and you have employees, the foundational ranks. How does the NPC or the worship analogy inform the required conduct for both?
Well, the burden falls first on the leaders. Just as the captain must be exemplary, those in the upper ranks have to exemplify ethical conduct and set the performance standard. They hold the position of Dengxi to serve, not to lord over others. They must demonstrate the character that justified their selection in the first place.
And for the foundational ranks, the employees who are currently operating in a role of lower Dengxi, what's their task?
Their task, according to the sources, is one of self-improvement and observation. They're instructed to learn from the strengths of those above them, to address their own weaknesses, and to utilize their natural gifts, their on-sea, to prepare for future roles.
So they are valuable in their current capacity, maintaining that ping-dang, that equality.
Yes, absolutely.
But the structure encourages growth towards higher Dengxi based on proven character.
That's it.
So what we ultimately derive from these sources is a guide to creating a high-integrity, loyal team, whether it's religious or corporate. A team influenced by democratic freedom, but guided by sound, non-political principles and deep personal accountability.
It's a blueprint for management that recognizes the human need for order while simultaneously protecting the human spirit's need for equality.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've used an ancient theological text and a very specific modern case study to really dissect this concept of Dengxi of rank. And we've seen that it can exist as an organizational necessity without enforcing value judgments. The worship analogy separated rank from worth, and the NPC's stringent rules provided the ultimate example of safeguarding order against human factionalism.
And this leaves us with one final thought, building on NPC's demand for character and leadership. If the establishment of order without inferiority requires leaders to be intensely focused on integrity, on acting as role models, how much more challenging is it to maintain that personal character when you're serving in a high Dengxi role that wasn't freely chosen?
You mean a role that wasn't selected based on gifts?
Right, but one that was mandated purely by politics or a secular appointment or just fortunate circumstance. What stands out to you about maintaining character when the system all around you is driven purely by manipulation?
That is a challenge for every leader and every aspiring leader across every single field. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring those ideas, and we'll see you next time.